Organizers largely used social media to plan the attack on the Capitol. A year after the riot, many say social media makes it harder to know what's true and what is not. And misinformation continues to be a serious concern as some users are becoming radicalized. Dan Patterson is here now to talk about the role social media plays in the spread of misinformation and the fallout from January 6, 2021. So, Dan, how has social media been inflaming tensions between the two parties since January 6th? I mean, we talked a lot about it prior to January 6th. Has it been ramped up to 11 since?
See you, Vlad. Look, leading up to January 6th, this was not private. Often these conversations happen in fairly massive Facebook groups or just hashtags on Twitter. We could see, for example, the Stop the Steal movement grow rapidly. And we know that according to the Facebook papers, which were leaked last fall by Frances Haugen, we know that Facebook kind of took their foot off the brake and allowed these groups to accelerate in the days and weeks leading to January 6th. Right after, of course, we saw a deplatforming of many of these conspiracy groups, but they all just kind of migrated over to sites like Telegram and elsewhere. Look, Vlad, the reality is that we can't just blame or point a finger at social media, but we do know that the algorithms used by almost all of these sites tend to favor engagement, and engagement is something that allowed a lot of the big lie or the smaller lies that comprise that big lie to spread so fast, so far, so quickly.
How is January 6th being remembered online by some of these communities? I don't even know if QAnon is a thing anymore. I had read somewhere that those Q drops stopped happening, but I'm pretty sure there's probably other groups and organizations that have replaced QAnon at this point. What are they saying?
Anne-Marie, confusion is the tactic that is most often deployed, and it's pretty effective. Look, there isn't just one line of reasoning or thinking that flows through all of these conspiracy groups. It's that all of these kind of talking points are mixed in with facts, and the point is to degrade facts. Of course, many of these conspiracies are kind of big and outrageous, but when you blend them in with the truth, then the truth also seems just as big and outrageous as the conspiracies, or as small and outrageous as some of the conspiracies might be. Look, the real thing here is that there is no real stopping the spread of dis and misinformation. But this focus on the evolution of groups, Anne-Marie, you said a moment ago that QAnon kind of doesn't exist. It does, but in a totally different form. The evolution of these groups evolves with conspiracies, and as they roll in different types of lies, the truth just kind of gets steamrolled.
So, Dan, we are coming up fast to the midterm elections. What can we expect from these conspiracy theories on social media as we look ahead to that? I will note that I have had people that I'm friends with who've sent me messages and sent me photos of, I don't know where they get them from, that juxtapose what we just showed our viewers as to actually what happened on January 6th. And then they'll send me a photo of like some grandmas, which they say are grandmothers visiting the Capitol on the 6th. And I have no idea. I don't generally engage because you have to have a shared sense of reality to be able to have an intelligent conversation. And I point this out, that these are friends of mine, but they do it to troll me, and I generally don't take the bait. But I sort of wonder where they're getting these images and how they're coming across them and what makes them think that they're legitimate. So what are you seeing and hearing as we look ahead to the midterms?
I expect facts to continue to be muddled with lies. Unfortunately, and maybe a little frightening, look, leading up to January 6th and then in the days afterwards, I spoke with people like Fred Brennan. He was a founder of the forum 8chan where QAnon really got its start. I also interviewed Ron Watkins, who many people believe was Q for a long time. And Fred says that, look, we should just expect violence to be a feature of American politics. No matter what President Biden may say or wish or want, the fact is that radicalization has happened and that many of these people are incredibly violent and motivated. So I think we can continue. We can expect to a continued degradation of the facts and truth, and we can expect violence.
The president spent a good chunk of his speech attacking the big lie, trying to provide facts to counter the disinformation. But still, millions of Americans believe that there was voter fraud in the 2020 election. At the time of the election, what we were seeing were, photos that were being misrepresented or sort of placed out of context. That sort of stuff was popping up online to prove, in quotation marks, that there was voter fraud. How is this idea of voter fraud still being perpetuated online?
Look, I hate to even say the channels where these lies exist, because oftentimes we can inadvertently amplify disinformation simply by talking about it. But let me give you one example that's happening here out in the open. You remember Ron Watkins, who I mentioned just a moment ago. Many people believe that he was Q, and he ran this message board, 8kun and 8chan, for years. Well, Ron is trying to legitimize himself. He says he's running for Congress in Arizona. He was a crucial part of this false attempt to delegitimize the ballots in Arizona. And now, Anne-Marie, he is working with Rudy Giuliani, one of the architects of the big lie. So, we can kind of see how conspiracy theories that start on these kind of creepy corners of the internet progressed into mainstream Republican politics and are now expressing themselves with some of the most powerful figures in Republican politics right now.
What are the major players pushing political misinformation, Dan?
Again, Vlad, it's hard to answer that without pushing people to these channels on Telegram. Watkins' channel is one of those, but he is now operating pretty much out in the open. There are some minor influencers within the QAnon world who continue to push the big lie. But really, Vlad, the sad thing is that these conspiracies have now, thanks to people like Watkins, Giuliani, and others, have now really made their way into mainstream Republican politics, and that is key. As we saw from our own polling, there are millions of people who are willing to believe, if not parts of the big lie, the entirety of it. So it is no longer minor. It is no longer something that requires influencers to perpetuate. The big lie is here. It is entrenched. It came from the internet. It came from, as they say, something awful, a corner of the internet. But it is here. It's entrenched, and it's mainstream.
So then what do we do to slow it down then? This whole time we've been talking about these, online platforms have to do more. Is it just about that, or is there something else?
I don't know. I mean, the honest answer is I don't know. I mean, there are bipartisan attempts to regulate social media, but we see people flocking to alternative sites, niche social media sites like Getter. We saw Joe Rogan and Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tim Pool, others who really are kind of tentpoles of the alt-right flock to these sites, no pun intended. Anne-Marie, I don't know. I can't prescribe solutions because I don't have any.
Dan and Anne-Marie, what's so interesting about these conversations is, and I know that we live in a very different world today in 2022 than the world was back in 1941, for example. But I bring up that because I've read some interesting books about specifically about Japan and how that country went essentially from an agrarian society in 1850 to one that was challenging essentially the entire world by World War II, and some of the atrocities committed in the name of the emperor by Japanese forces and by the Japanese people themselves during World War II. And one of the things that was really, really interesting is when years after the war, when you spoke to people, and this was true in Nazi Germany as well, why people behaved the way that they did, why there was a kind of why we saw the atrocities and the crimes against humanity that we saw back then. People actually said that they were almost like in a trance. I know it's really strange, but that they said that the information that they were receiving felt and sounded real. It confirmed their bias about people, whether they were Chinese or other Asians, or in the case of Nazi Germany, Jews. And so when they were directed to do something, it made sense to them. And then after those things ended, it was almost as if they woke up from a dream or a nightmare saying, I can't believe I did those things. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And I wonder if we're in a similar situation. Even though we have technology at our fingertips, the truth is out there if people want to find it, but increasingly they're going down these rabbit holes.
My feelings matter more than the truth. I mean, I'm using that as an example, Vlad, but you point out confirmation bias, and I think that one thing social media might be incredibly good at doing is reinforcing the things we already believe. That is confirmation bias. But look, I present this not as just about me. This is a bigger issue, but for years leading up to the 6th, I received death threats. Then right after the 6th, I talked to some of these people, along with some of our producers here at CBS News, and they said something very similar, Vlad, that like, oh, geez, I really didn't even think there was a human on the other end. I didn't think that you were a person I was sending this to, and you're just talking to me like a normal guy. I just kind of thought of you as the media, and so I sent these obnoxious messages. I think that we have something like that at very large scale. This isn't just about trolling. It is about the conversion of rational belief into radicalized belief, and it expresses itself right now, sadly, as violence.
Yeah, you know, Vlad, when I was hearing you sort of describe that, the FBI has released some transcripts of interviews that they had with some of the people who entered the Capitol on January 6th, and there's been some recordings released, in court cases. And, you know, I think many of us have seen Officer Fanone. He's talked a lot about his experiences. He had gone down to the Capitol building, and he was tased or zapped, or some sort of weapon was used on him. And that individual, when asked by the FBI, why did you do that? He sort of said, I don't know. I mean, he's a human being. He has children. And when you talk about sort of the trans being broken, and I know it's not like that for everyone clearly, because what Dan is pointing out is there's an appetite for these conspiracy theories, a healthy appetite. So it's not like that for everyone. But I think for some people, it's true. It's like they've sort of snapped out of it. But I think the difference between the periods of time that you were talking about and what we're living in now is there are so many outlets to get information, both truthful and non-truthful. As Dan says, you know, you can curate your reality. And there's always kind of a voice of authority backing up your feelings. And so there's no reason to get snap out of that trance for some people.
That is a good point. If it was just people, if it was just sort of crackpots that were putting this information out, then perhaps the appetite for it would be diminished. But as you say, there are oftentimes people that, and I'm not suggesting that, you know, advanced education or advanced degrees means that you're smarter than somebody who doesn't have those things. But there are many people, sometimes you get, in the case of COVID, you get doctors who say, you know, vaccines don't work. And so it lends an air of credibility to something that somebody else might be saying, either on radio or in writing or on television. And so somebody goes, well, you know, that person, you know, has a PhD in politics from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and he believes in the fact that the election was rigged. So what does he know that the lamestream media, you know, is just hiding from you, is, you know, what you often come across. And I think that's what we're talking about, Dan.
It is once again, confirmation bias, using authority figures as a cornerstone of confirmation of feelings. But look, I don't want to imply that those who were violent or broke the law, who stormed the Capitol, are innocent. They are not. They are criminals. However, I'd also like to suggest that they're also victims of disinformation, along with their cohort, the larger cohort who maybe didn't storm the Capitol, and that perhaps, Anne-Marie, the real answer to your question, I don't know how we accomplish this, but the real answer to your question of the solution, it might be empathy. It might be to look at our fellow citizens as also victims of lies, the big lie, and that the conditions that created these mobs, inequity, are real and need to be addressed. The way it expresses itself, once again, violence, not okay. But many of these people want something that is perhaps okay. They want the same thing we all want, which is for our families to flourish and our neighbors to flourish. Their rage comes from some place that might be stoked by the algorithms of social media and a leader who seemed intent on, as President Biden said, his own ego, his own desire for power, taking precedent over what's good for the country and his own followers.
Dan, you are spot on. I think you nailed it. It is only through empathy and compassion that we can open a dialogue. I mean, it's been a year now. I think that's where the direction of this country should be going. Let's focus on our common ground, our common dreams. It's plenty more of that than what divides us.
And I will point out to what you, I would just say, Anne-Marie and Dan, to what you said. There is a huge difference. Dan, you pointed it out. When people reach out to you on social media, when they text you or when they email you, it's a very different vibe than when you're sitting face to face and having a conversation with somebody, which is generally why I don't engage with trolls online or even friends of mine. Friends of mine, they'll email me things or they'll text me things and they'll want my hot take on it. And I know that whatever I respond, they're going to come, because they have, I guess, nothing better to do than to sit there on their phones or their computers and reply back to me with all the reasons why I may be wrong or I'm not telling them. But you know, once you sit down and you have a conversation with somebody and you get at the nugget and the kernel of what it is that they're thinking about or what it is that they're concerned about, and then they hear from you, it's a very different conversation. I've had those conversations with people who say things that are incendiary. And then when you sit down in front of me, hey, you know, thing you talked about, you know, do you really mean that? Well, no, I don't really mean that. I'm just angry. You know, I'm just, you know, or no one's listening to me or no one's hearing me. And so once you can bridge that divide by saying, well, let me hear what you got to say and let me tell you what I think, you know, and then you meet on a human level as opposed to a digital level, I think there you can start to see real change.
Tech likes to talk a lot about scale. We need to scale empathy.
That's right.
Scale empathy. So true. Vlad, I suggest you do not look at your phone for the rest of the afternoon. I suspect that some of your friends will be frantically texting you responses. Dan, you know, we started out with this conversation talking about technology, which you would think would be devoid of things like emotion, but we end up, you know, putting the heart back into technology. Dan, a pleasure talking to you as usual.
You too. Good to see you.